Alright, welcome to this recording of the structured essay questions, the SEQs for chapters 4 and 5. I'm going to be doing both together, so you shouldn't have finished both chapters before coming to look at this video. You probably would have finished chapter 4 and then you come and watch this video. So I will try my best to separate out the two chapters so that the first part, right, is on chapter 4 and then the second part is on chapter 5. I'm not going to separate it into two videos because, all the questions are, are on the same document, okay? And also, as you would have seen, as you would see, all right, so I'm going to start. Right, so the first part, if you take a look at the questions here, this one is on chapter 5 and this is chapter 4. So that's why in the O-level questions, they will mix the chapters together, chapters 4 and 5, because they are very close and closely related. So they can actually link them together into part A and part B. It is also possible for them to mix it together with chapters 6 and 7 because chapters 4, 5, 6, 7, they are all on World War II. So the possibility is there, but I don't think I have seen that before happening. Okay, now, first of all, let's not look at the O-level questions. Now, if you have finished chapter 4 and 5, all right, if you just finished chapter 4, you should start thinking about what is the basic question, right? The question that I told you guys that you always need to know what is the basic question. So it usually goes by the main reason, right? So the main reason for a certain issue is because of this particular given factor. So if you take a look at the questions from the other schools, that's where you actually get to see it, right? Here, policy of appeasement is your given factor, and the outbreak of World War II in Europe is your issue. Okay, similarly down here, World War II broke out in Europe, that's the issue, and failure of the appeasement policy, right? So you should have thought of that before when you finish the chapter. So that's the basic question that you would be expected to answer. So then now, pause for a moment and think about what are the other possible given factors. Right, the video isn't paused. Now, so given that there are many factors, okay, for chapter 4, okay, there's policy of appeasement, there is Hitler's expansionist policy, and there's also the parts on weakness of the League of Nations. All right, so those are the three major factors. However, there will be actually many small little sub factors, right? Like for example, the Munich Agreement, which was one of the major appeasement policies. Also, the Nazi-Soviet pact, to me, that was also an important factor that actually caused World War II to break out, because without which, it might have been a situation where Hitler would not have dared to invade Poland yet. It might have delayed. Maybe it wouldn't have actually caused World War II not to start. So, right, so that's the basic question that you need to be able to deal with. Now, the challenge for that particular kind of question, right, okay, to answer these type of questions is when they actually give you a main factor as Hitler's expansionist policy. That's when you need to be a little bit concerned. So far, if you look at the O-level questions, it has not been tested. In fact, the so-called, my version of so-called the basic question has not been tested for chapter 4. It has been tested for chapter 5, which is very easy, okay? But for chapter 4, it's not been tested yet. So then how? Why is it a challenge? It's because, right, if you look at the factor on Hitler's expansionist policy, is a huge factor. So that's the question that I would have gotten you to do it first, okay? Because it would test your ability to be able to summarize that one whole gigantic factor and put it into one paragraph that you can write for the exam. So that would be the standard paragraph that you can make use of if ever you face it in any WAs or exams or the O-levels. That should be made full use of. Okay, so start practicing that first. Don't wait for the standard answer to fall into your lap because there can be many different versions of it. Okay, so start practicing that first. Write into something. Do a do a paragraph in which, right, it would be a respectable length. You've got to bear in mind, right, that whatever that you have written has to fit into an exam timing, which is in a 12-mark SEQ, 25 minutes. In one factor, maybe 10 minutes. In 10 minutes, are you able to finish writing that? One factor. Sounds like a lot. Actually, it isn't. Okay, unless you write really very quickly, and then that would work for you. But otherwise, yeah, that would be a challenge. So you should start off with one of these questions. The given factor doesn't matter. You should try to write all three factors. Okay. Now, in an actual exam, I think it will be actually challenging to produce all three factors, because when you do that, right, think about it, you are essentially writing the entire chapter into one 12-mark question. Okay, that almost the entire chapter into one 12-mark question, which would be really, not say extreme, but it would be actually really really long. Yeah, your entire 12-mark essay would be really long. So focus on failure of appeasement, or rather appeasement policy, and Hitler's expansionist policy. These two, you should include them because they more or less go hand in hand. The next challenge, right, okay, is about the appeasement policy. How do you actually summarize that factor? And you got to bear in mind the textbook, right? What they were doing is that they were actually giving reasons for appeasement. That is very different from the appeasement policy leading to the outbreak of World War II in Europe. Do you see the difference? Okay, I'm going to say again. The textbook actually discusses reasons for appeasement. Like, for example, they needed time to rearm. Okay, that is a reason why they decided on the appeasement policy. But that's not how the appeasement policy caused World War II to start. There is a difference. So the parts in the textbook is pretty tricky, and whatever that I've taught in the slides, you need to actually change it and basically answer to the question of how did the policy of appeasement led to the outbreak of World War II in Europe. You will find yourself making use of things that has already been mentioned under Hitler's expansionist policy. That's fine, as long as you can overlap events. Okay, like for example, the Munich Agreement, it is applicable to Hitler's expansionist policy. It is also applicable to policy of appeasement. You can make use of that one event, but how you write it, basically it boils down to your English and how you're able to phrase it to be able to answer the question of how did the policy of appeasement led to the outbreak of World War II in Europe. Okay, now, so at this point, to summarize the basic question, your two challenges. Number one, to summarize Hitler's expansionist policy into one respectable paragraph. Number two, the policy of appeasement needs to be phrased in a way that you're answering how did it cause World War II to break out and not reasons for appeasement. Okay, so if you're able to get that out of the way, that will be the basic question done. Okay, now what I would want to look at next, all right, would be other types of 12-mark questions first. So if you look at the O-level questions, right, okay, this and this, okay, these two questions are chapter 4 questions. They are actually quite challenging. Now let's look at the first question. All right, now the policy of appeasement destroyed any hopes of resisting Hitler's aggression. Now I want you to pause for a minute and think, how do you disagree with the statement? Okay, now if you've paused the video and come back here again, you could have two possible answers. The first one is the policy of appeasement did not destroy any hopes of resisting Hitler's aggression. So that's your disagree part, right? I disagree. How far do you agree with the statement? I disagree because the policy of appeasement actually didn't destroy any hopes of resisting Hitler's aggression. So that's the first way to disagree. The second way is that I disagree with the statement because something else destroyed any hopes of resisting Hitler's aggression. So, in other words, the second one makes this the issue. Okay? Whereas the first one, okay, I'm confused myself. So the second one makes use of this as the issue, and then this is the given factor. Right? Okay? Whereas the second one, right, it takes the entire thing into an issue and the opposite of that. So, like for example, actually, these kind of questions I call them a judgment questions. Like for example, Hitler's rule was a success. So how you disagree with it was that Hitler's rule was not a success, right? For that question, it would have been difficult for you to change Hitler's rule because that's not a given factor. So you can't do something else like, I disagree that Hitler's rule was a success because Stalin's rule was also a success. Yeah, that is not workable. Okay, but coming back to this, there were two different interpretations, right? So which one is acceptable? Just now the Stalin Hitler example is definitely not acceptable. However, in this case, both makes sense. So both interpretations of that question makes sense. So then it boils down to which one is easier to do, right? So take some time, think about it. Which one would be easier to do? The policy of appeasement did not destroy any hopes of resisting Hitler's aggression, or was there something else that actually destroyed any hopes of resisting Hitler's aggression? Okay, so now if you have thought about it, you realize for me, I think the first one is easier to do. The policy of appeasement did not destroy any hopes of resisting Hitler's aggression because it boils down then to the reasons of appeasement. And that's where you're able to make use of certain reasons to be able to answer how it didn't destroy any hopes of resisting Hitler's aggression. If you want to change, if you go by the second interpretation and you want to change the policy of appeasement, that might be a bit more challenging, right? That might be a bit more challenging in that you would actually have to change that factor to something else like the weaknesses of the League of Nations. Okay, it will be difficult to make use of Hitler's aggressive expansionist policy because if you put it in right, it just sounds weird. Hitler's expansionist policy destroyed any hopes of resisting his own aggression. It doesn't make sense. So then you got to go back to the weakness of the League of Nations as another factor to answer this question. Now that I think about it out loud, it seems like the second one also possible to do. But either way, okay, both interpretations are acceptable. Okay, both interpretations are acceptable. Okay, so that is the O-level question here. The other one here, all right, Munich Agreement was a disaster for Britain. This one, I don't think that you can go by how we did the second one and then you change the Munich conference to be another factor. Again, it would actually might go down the road of not making sense. So the way to disagree with this statement would be the Munich conference was not a disaster for Britain. Okay? So this is where you actually need to make use again of the reasons for appeasement. So again, the factor of buying time to rearm comes in and it actually helps you to be able to disagree with the statement. It wasn't a disaster because it gave them time to rearm. Otherwise, they might not have been able to stand up to Hitler and be the last country standing, which would be chapter 5's information that would help you to understand what I'm talking about right now. Okay? So that basically is the O-level questions. Okay? Now, if you just take a quick glance at the rest of the questions here, this is chapter 4, a little challenging. Okay? And then, okay, I'm just going to pause here for a minute. Okay, you would have realized that my highlighted yellow ones are the chapter 4 questions. This one itself focuses just simply on Hitler as a factor, so that would be Hitler's expansionist policy. This one compares two factors, signing of the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact and Chamberlain's policy of appeasement. So these two factors are discussed here. Now for this particular question, right, it might look challenging. Okay, but it's not. Basically, you just have to address both factors. And at your conclusion, that's where you actually argue and make your stand. Okay, which one is more important as a factor to embolden Hitler to expand into Europe. Okay, then you only discuss these two factors. So essentially, they're giving you your agree and disagree factors. You just need to do these two factors and that's it. So actually, it does make things slightly easier. Okay, right. Again, Germany was to blame. This one, it basically covers Hitler completely. Right, so let me just move on. Okay. Right, you should have been pausing at those moments to just glance through the questions, or maybe not glance, or really read each question in detail. You would realize that the questions are kind of repeated, right? More or less. There isn't any other different kind of ways of asking. So if you're able to deal with those questions, these types of questions, yeah, you will be pretty much set. Okay, for to answer the questions for chapter 4. All right. Okay, so now at this point in time, let's go on to chapter 5. Right, chapter 5, again, the basic question would be the main reason why Germany was defeated. And you can see that in the O-level question here, where they actually gave you the given factor, fighting on too many fronts, and the issue is Germany was defeated. Right? And so, for this particular question, again, it's similar to chapter 4. The given factor is not actually one of the main reasons, it's one of the sub-reasons. The three main reasons, to recap, for Hitler's defeat in World War II, USA strengths, German weaknesses, and the last one is on the resistance factor. Okay, so based on those three factors, those are the reasons. And then under Hitler's weaknesses, rather Germany's weaknesses, that would be Hitler's army fighting on too many fronts. That will be another one of the factors. That was one of the major factors that caused him to lose World War II. So that's why they're using it here as one of the questions, as one of the factors to support that particular issue. Okay? Right, so if you're able to deal with that question, all right, oh, shucks, I forgot about the 8-mark questions. Let me get back to that. Let me finish the chapter 5 12-mark questions first. Okay. Then you see another comparison question of chapter 5. Okay, where they have two factors: German tactical errors. Sorry, this should be green. As well as Allied collaboration. Two factors, and the issue is contributing to Germany's defeat. Alright. Okay, Hitler's actions. This one is quite easily identifiable. Germany should be blamed. Again, it's the given factor question. German invasion of Soviet Union. That is a tricky given factor. Make sure you know what is it about. Okay, you realize that for this particular chapter, right, most of them are given factor questions, okay, except for this one, right, the fall of Germany was inevitable. Now these questions are challenging. If you're here in Sec 4, you should have dealt with the questions. If you're here as a Sec 3 student, well, we try to avoid talking about these questions first, because not to demoralize you and kill you. But nonetheless, if you were to think about this question, okay, it's inevitable. Rephrase it as avoidable. So was it avoidable or was it unavoidable? Now these kind of inevitable questions, right, there are quite a few other chapters that can make use of the inevitableness of it. So that's where you actually need to group the factors into what can be avoided and what cannot be avoided. For example, let's take a simpler chapter on Stalin, okay, where they talk about rise of Stalin. And let's use the rise of Stalin. Was it inevitable? Okay, so that's where you think about, if if Lenin's will and testament was actually released, that might actually have not allowed Stalin to rise to power. So that would be under the avoidable parts. Okay, the evitable part. Rise of Stalin was avoidable because Lenin's testament could have been released, and then that would have actually stopped him. Okay, so basically you take the factors and then you put them into what is unavoidable and what is avoidable. And of course, what would be important would be your links or your explanations. Okay, those needs to be clear in actually explaining why is it avoidable and why is it unavoidable. So this is where you realize that my notes will not be able to help you entirely. And this is where where you would face more challenging questions and require you to think more during the exam. Okay? All right. Okay, so the rest of the questions are pretty straightforward. Okay? All right. Continue taking a look at the rest of the questions. Okay, you should be able to see that there's some kind of consistency in the way that the schools are asking the questions. But by the way, if I didn't mention already, and you should have realized it at the top, okay, it's the other schools' prelim questions, all these. All right. Okay, so we are pretty much done with the 12-mark questions for both chapters. Now, if you're able to deal with them, the challenge here would be actually the 8-mark questions because they can ask you on anything. All right, like for example, if you take a look at this one, okay, chapter 4, explain why Hitler was able to remilitarize the Rhineland. It goes into really specific details about why Hitler was able to remilitarize the Rhineland. You could use the general factors to say because Britain and France adopted the policy of appeasement, because Britain was showing sympathy towards Germany and they refused to actually take any action against them. But for this particular question, you might also need some specific information as to France was actually holding elections at that time and they didn't want to engage Hitler. And so therefore they decided to let him remilitarize the Rhineland. So that as a factor should ideally come up to answer this question. If not, the reasons for appeasement might be able to help you to answer this question. Okay? Now, and this one actually is really quite a bit challenging. Explain why the Munich conference was held in 1938. Now, you probably would again think that this question would be similar to this, and you're not wrong, totally wrong. You would actually talk about the reasons for appeasement, and they want to avoid another war. But the O-level markers report actually did mention that the two factors, I'm sure they accepted other factors, but the two factors they were looking for is the first one that would be the fear of a general war. So again, boils down to reasons why they decided to appease. And the second one, they phrased it as something like the need to know what to do with Sudetenland. I mean, like, duh, isn't the Munich conference to do with that particularly? So they took it as like a literal factor. But then, yes, I know there's a factor that makes sense, but then as to how to write it out as a factor in a paragraph format, I would have a little bit of trouble myself coming up with the details to actually answer this question. So in other words, I think the textbook would actually help you to be able to answer the question, but the problem would be that my notes won't be able to answer that. And you would realize again the 8-mark questions would test on something quite specific within the chapter. So that's why you still need to make use of the textbook extensively to be able to answer the 8-mark questions. Okay, right. And you will also realize that so far they haven't asked anything about at least in O levels, they haven't asked any 8-mark questions on chapter 5. They will mix it with chapter 4. You realize that in the core, right, if you're coming from a core class, you will realize that this is chapter 4. This is also chapter 4. Okay? Whereas this is chapter 4 and chapter 5 for elective. It's not how do I put this? It's not a pattern that you should follow. It doesn't mean to say that if you are from a core full history class, it will be basically one chapter across both parts A and B. And if you're from an elect class, it is a mix of chapters. It really depends. Okay, so there's no such pattern as of what I observe so far. And anyway, with that information, it doesn't help you at all. Okay, so the chapter 5 8-mark question, what I think some schools would like to ask would be USA's role before before they actually officially entered World War II, which I don't see any school asking about that at this time. Hmm. Yeah, why? Okay, but I would actually look into that particular possible question. When I look at the two factors of why would USA actually, what was USA's role before they actually officially entered World War II after Pearl Harbor? Okay, right. That pretty much summarizes this this lecture on the SEQs for chapters 4 and 5.